Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Christian, and I'm going to be the host of the webinar. It's part of our expert series here at Acutics, where we are inviting smart minds to tell about different subjects that we think are interesting. So I'm really looking forward to today. I've invited Dan White, who I actually had the pleasure of making a webinar with earlier in a long time ago, actually, who will be speaking about driving a unified marketing data model, or at least some concepts around it that I'm really looking forward to see. Yes. So very briefly, we are Acutics, and we work out of Copenhagen here in Denmark. I haven't been very much live the last 4 or 5 months because I've just been battling a case of cancer, but now I'm back, so I'm really looking forward to this first webinar after it. Yes. So what are we going to get out of today's webinar? Well, I hope it's going to be a conversation, and we have a few things on our minds. So first of all, what really impacts the ROI on your ads? How to think about creativity when advertising in a global sense. The importance of measuring apples to apples across teams and countries. And that's it. So I hope everybody will get something out of it. As said, it's very much live. So anyone who is in the chat, you can jump into the conversation as well if you like to. We also have made a few polls ready, just to have it as a bit of a to open the dialogue a little bit, also with the audience that are participating today. If you find it really interesting, then there's also going to be an on-demand version of this webinar just after the webinar is over, so you can share it with friends and family. Yes. So how did this actually come to happen? 2 months ago, Dan posted this very interesting model on his LinkedIn page, and I saw that. I read it and tried to understand it, and I thought, okay, this is a really, really good subject to talk about. It's the unified growth model for marketing. It requires a lot of thinking to get to this point. Dan has been doing, he's an author, and he's been creating these visualizations to help understand some of the core theories within marketing, because sometimes a boring book can be a little bit hard to keep top of mind. So small visual versions of them can be a little bit easier to just open the mind again and get it back on top, so you remember all of these good things that you need to know. And we're going to present a few other similar visuals today. I know Dan has made a lot of nice stuff ready, so I'm really looking forward to that. But then I'll let you introduce yourself in 2 seconds. First of all, I just want to start with a poll, just to get everybody used to the idea how it works. So the poll is basically, do you experience that your company is measuring apples to apples? So you can just answer what you think. It should be quite easy and straightforward. Then let me just get back to my slides here. Then we have Dan, and Dan, I tried to Google your name, and it seemed like you have a hard competition when it comes to search engine optimization. But maybe you wanna.
Yeah, no, it's quite frustrating when people search my name. There is a famous mass murderer who obviously dominates the first sort of 2 or 3 pages. So and also it's quite a generic name, Dan White. It's not very distinctive. But no. Hopefully, if you put Dan White, author of the Smart Marketing book, you might, if you're lucky, find my content. But anyway, thanks for having me, Christian. Good to be here.
Yeah, no problem, of course. So Dan, I think if you're ready for it, I'll put you on with your slides. Maybe just before we do that, I can see we already have quite a few people actually entering in on the poll, and it seems like some are. Oh, one person is actually measuring apples to apples, but yeah, the leading is apples to pears, and the giraffes are just after. So I'm not sure
Oh, you put that in, did you? Yeah, yeah.
the world is not doing this well on this matter. So that's
That's
really
wonderful,
cool. I'm
isn't it?
just gonna close down the poll here, and then let's move forward here. So, if are you ready with your slides?
I am. Am I sharing my screen for you?
Now you are. I
Yeah.
just made sure of it. There we go. Here you go.
So let me take you through the origin of this framework, a slightly updated version that I'm showing you now. It was a year or so ago. I was asked by the MMA to create some visual and verbal summaries, just one-page summaries, from 6 of their speakers in the great growth debates. So real gurus in the area, including Professor Byron Sharp and Dr. Peter Fader, Dr. Dominic Hansen's, lots of six very influential people in this area. And it was great. It was a fantastic project. But what I noticed was that there was much more commonality between the 6 gurus than there were differences. And I thought, well, I got quite excited by this. I thought, what I'd try and do is to capture those commonalities in a graphic, which is the circle you can see here on the screen, but also flag on the outside that kind of effectively about 4 areas where there are still some, I suppose, heated debates, in the industry about what works. So I'll just briefly take you through. I know this is quite a complex diagram, and actually, Professor Byron Sharp said to me afterwards, he said, well, this diagram is all very well, but these often help the person who creates it more than the people who receive it. But I'm hoping you'll find it useful too. So when you think about it, I mean, obviously, what we're trying to do is drive purchase, either now or in the long term. That's what drives value for the brand. And at the top half, you've got kind of the advertising influence, the things you can do through communications to build and drive that purchase. And most people would agree, I think, that this needs to be a combination of brand building advertising that raises the salience, the mental availability of your brand, makes it top of mind, makes it feel relevant, for example, but also activation advertising, which is right there in the middle, which helps to trigger that demand near to the point of sale to actually get the sale. So building that presence and then reminding people at the right time to close the sale. And that's a kind of a common theme of modern thinking about how communications work. And then, of course, on the left-hand side, you've got, well, that's all very well, but people will only buy a product or a service if it's fairly easy for them to get at it. In any competitive market, people, if they can't find a brand, they'll probably just go for another brand because there are so many brands that are, let's be honest, broadly similar. So physical availability or ease of buying are absolutely crucial if you want to leverage the equity that you built through your advertising. And then at the bottom, you've got the role of innovation. Innovation, but not just in the area of product innovation, although that's important, because innovation is about building a product that when people hear about it, they're interested, and when they experience it, they're delighted by it. And then finally, you've got the kind of feedback loop is the way I think of it, which is after people have bought a product or a service and they experience it, did it live up to expectations for the price? If it did, that's fantastic, and people tend to come back because it's an easy option next time. And also, if it's exceptional, it'll lead to positive reviews, and word of mouth that will then feed back in terms of effectively as earned communications, earned media. So I kind of like to capture this in one visual, and then around the outside of just a few of the areas that are still being debated. Christian, does that make sense?
I think it makes very much sense, and I'm sure it helped you, as Byron Sharp said, more than when you just see it yourself. Then,
Yeah.
but I think like when you go through it, it makes a lot of sense. And I think from a company perspective, it's a great organization of things you should actually have in place and think about. Are we doing all these different things? But I actually just got a question from Richard. I'll just bring it up here so we can all see it. So he asks me, or asks you actually, Dan, in your unified marketing growth model, which is excellent. The one bit I struggle with is separating salient mental availability from highly regarded brand image. Don't you think these two things are linked? We remember what we want to remember.
Yeah, I think they probably are linked, but they're not quite the same. And the way I think about it is mental availability is the ability of the brand to come to mind quickly, spontaneously without having to think, come to mind quickly in the context of a need.
Yeah.
That's mental availability definition, which in most cases will give the brand a strong bias towards being chosen. And that's kind of the big driver. Brand, sorry, I can't remember the phrase that was used there, but brand regard, was it? Yeah. As in what people think and feel about a brand once they think of the brand, once it does come to mind, is a slightly separate thing, because it could be very positive, or in some cases it might not be as positive. Let me give you an example I like to use to make this distinction. I mean, and again, apologies if there are anyone in the Nestle organization on the call, but for many years, especially in the 80s and 90s, when people were thinking about baby food, baby milk, a brand that would come to mind is, of course, Nestle. They make a whole range. But there was some very, very, at the time, some very negative connotations about how the organization was merchandising this in certain countries. So therefore, mental availability was very, very high in that context. But what people then thought of, how they regarded a brand, was actually quite negative. And I'm sure they've done everything, to solve this now. But at the time, it was more negative. So although the brand was mentally available, people would then use their, it's called system 2 mind, their more rational, considered, intellectual mind to say, no, okay, I'd rather go for a different brand.
Yeah.
Which obviously, so they're not the same, but they tend to go together. If you build one, you're likely to build the other. There are exceptions, and I think what Byron Sharp has done a great job of is to make marketers realize that the more you do to make the brand mentally available through things like distinctive brand assets, so visuals and shortcuts and mental mnemonics and jingles and all these things, are actually really powerful, because usually that's enough to secure the sale.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think, and I can see what you mean as well. That's a very good explanation. I hope, Richard, that you got the answer that you were looking for this question. Cool. Well, I'll just put your slides back on then. So let's have a little bit of look into this creativity.
And, creativity. Yeah, I think this is really, really important. So I've got a couple of slides to share on this. I mean, focusing first on the data, the reality, if you like, on the right. This is an analysis conducted by Nielsen a few years ago, and it's been widely quoted, and actually is very consistent with other findings from other companies, which is that when you look at campaigns and the variables that affect whether or not the campaign generates a strong sales uplift, it's actually creativity that has the biggest influence. In other words, if you've got a highly effective creative, you get a strong sales uplift, and if you don't, you get a very small sales uplift. And that influences the media choice. In other words, choices about media that affect frequency or recency or who you're targeting. And that contrasts actually with what marketers typically think. So this data on the left shows the equivalent from a survey conducted last year by the MMA, where actually marketers think that media choices have the biggest dominance and creativity has relatively less power. So I think it's quite important, because I think at the moment because media is so complex and confusing and diverse, media agencies, of course, have a lot of say in how you create and run and plan your campaigns. But we're kind of forgetting that the actual creativity that you put, the content that you deploy in those media, can have it's a bigger variable. I used to work for Kantar Millwall Brown, which was the creative effectiveness division for Kantar. And we used to say that the biggest variable, the most variable was the creativity, and the data certainly supports that. In fact, my next slide illustrates this. So,
Wait 2 seconds. Wait
of
2 seconds
course,
there, because there's actually a question coming in
yeah,
here, and while we take that question, I also have a little poll that just is very closely related to this specific slide. Give me 1 second here. So I'm just going to start it here for everyone. So the poll goes like this: Do your company measure creativity and the impact on your advertisements? So yeah, you can just go ahead. And while people are answering to that, we can take this question. It's 2 seconds. I'll just jump into this one mode and we'll take the question here. A great framework would that be also relevant to drive the growth of existing customers via upsell, excel, recontracting, and retention in subscription-based business like telecom?
yeah, this is a huge question. And actually, there's a whole book that I would strongly recommend people in these kind of businesses to look at, which is at yeah, I don't know if you got me on the screen at the moment, Christian, but the sequel to How Brands Grow, so How Brands Grow 2, it explores in quite a lot of detail about whether these principles of, you know, whether penetration is seen in a lot of categories, right, to be the driver. Yeah. And the idea is that if you focus on penetration, the other loyalty factors and upsells and cross-sell opportunities come with it. And I think there's incredible evidence to say that is true. And that and by contrast, if a business focuses on their existing consumer base and focuses on cross-selling and upselling amongst that group, there's nothing wrong in doing that, of course, but if you do that to the exclusion of trying to bring in new customers over time, you know, and increase your penetration, or at least keep your penetration as high as it is with people leaving, then long term your growth prospects are damaged. It's important to continually think about penetration because the others, it's almost like which way around.
Yeah.
The data suggests that the higher penetration, you will almost not automatically, but you are bound in most businesses to benefit from those additional increased value, sales, and you know, customer loyalty and lifetime value, etc. And it's a bit of a philosophy, really, but there is some very, if you actually look at the scientific data, and there's a lot of it in the book, in this book, it suggests that in every kind of business, the focus should be on penetration if you want to grow. In the long term, not the short term. There's always a big difference. Short term, yes, get your existing clients, get them to upsell, but in the long term, it's about penetration. I think that short term, long term distinction is quite important as well.
Yeah, I think when Peter Field and Les Bennett talks about the short and the long of it, it's also quite interesting to think about activation as also a brain building activity, because no matter how you're going to put it, you're going to have some kind of brain effect with the stuff that you put out to people, right?
Both. I mean, both. It's one of these crazy things, you know, what people call brand building will have some activation effect, and what people call activation advertising will have some brand building effect. It's just the balance of the two. And that's why I think, you know, Bennett and Field kind of recommend a 60. The data suggests that a 60-40 split, doesn't it?
Yeah.
With slightly more on brand building is more effective long term.
Yeah.
In the short term, activate. But it depends on how much cash you've got as a business and how, you know, how long you can survive without short term. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It costs a little bit now, but it's good in the long term, right?
In the long term, yeah, exactly. So it's a lot to do with how much investment you've got and how easily you can persuade the powers that be who have the budget that it's worth waiting for that return, because it will come, and the data will say it will come. But yeah, it's hard for a business that's on the short term cycles. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I'm just going to bring up the poll. It's quite interesting, the result here. So there's only one.
Okay, so not really. No.
That says yes here, and 33% says no. I'm not sure. There's also quite a few, and a lot that.
I wish we did. So actually, 92. Well, effectively 99 out of 10 are saying not. You don't really. Wow. Okay. Now I think that's really important. I mean, my next slide here, Christian, that I put flashed up earlier. I'll just maximize it now. This is why I'm passionate about creativity. Now, okay, this does need a bit of explaining. This is data from Kantar. It's been published, which is for online video advertising, and it's a histogram. So effectively, um, here on the left-hand side, you've got the percentage uplift achieved in ad awareness, right, per 100 ratings. So in other words, how much uplift you get for the amount of exposure that you paid for, all right? So in other words, there are some, 4% of all campaigns, unfortunately, only achieved a 1% uplift in ad awareness for their 100 ratings, compared with, the best, the most effective campaigns that achieved, and there's about 8% of all campaigns did this, those campaigns achieved more than 12% uplift in ad awareness per 100 ratings. So you can see from the best to the worst, you've got a factor of more than 10. In other words, it is possible, because purely of the differences in creative effectiveness, to have a response that is 10 times bigger because of creative quality. That goes back to what I said. Creative remains the biggest variable of all variables. So the hard thing is, of course, creativity is hard to manage and ensure and engineer. But any company that can foster and measure creativity can create a huge competitive advantage. Does that make sense? I mean, it's quite a complex point, but I'm hoping that makes sense. In other words, it's the variability in terms of impact is phenomenal, and much more, as we talked about before, than nuances in terms of targeting and reach, etc.
Yeah, exactly. I think actually what Gary says here is
Yeah,
quite close to it, because he says that Mark Ritson did a video on market share versus share of voice and stated that the second biggest driver of increasing market share was creativity. And you could say, because you were saying the variable that you can work with is the creativity, because the brand
yeah.
is kind of what it
The
is, right?
brand, exactly. The brand is what it is. I mean, the brand variable is basically brand size, brand penetration, or whatever how they measure it. But yeah, fine. You can't adjust that. You can't say, oh, I want my advertising to be more effective, so I'll double the size of my brand. No, it's circular. So it's almost irrelevant. It's the only thing you have control of are the media choices you make and the creativity that you use. So and if between the two, creative is the much bigger variable, and also we have a lot of learning again from Byron Sharp that actually, if you focus on reach, you'll probably be, generally that's a good principle anyway. Then creative is the big variable for competitive advantage. So you need to know how your creative's doing and how to create better, more effective creative in future, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I just have, yeah, let's go back to your slides here. And then,
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess this takes us on to, okay, creativity, and this is particularly relevant for anyone in the audience who creates, call it international, a multi-country organization, which is that, I mean, obviously, as the world has become more digital, more and more advertising is distributed globally, you know. But I found, okay, this is based on a huge project. It is a little while ago, I must admit, but I can't think of any particular reason why things would have changed significantly. But a project, this is, I worked with Ogilvy, uh, ad agency, and we looked at how well advertising in one country, whether or not an effective campaign in one country is likely to work well in a different country. And I think we were quite surprised by actually how difficult it is for that to happen. In fact, the headline statistic is that only 1 in 3 of ads that were defined as being great performance in one country also achieved great performance in another. There was a relationship. In other words, if you're better in one, you're more likely to be better in another. But there was absolutely no guarantee that a great ad in one country would be an effective ad in another country. And what I've tried to do here is to kind of summarize some of the correlations, because there were some differences between pairs. of countries. So, for example, um, the highest correlation, in fact, the highest correlation of all was between France and Spain. Interesting, specifically, France and Spain. So within Western Europe, the correlations were high, but particularly between France and Spain, but also between Germany, UK, France, Italy, Spain. They were all fairly high. That was number one. And then there was also a reasonable correlation between those countries and the US. And as I guess you might guess, given what I'm about to talk about, the correlation between US and Canada was also quite high. But there were some other anomalies that you would not necessarily expect just from geographic and historical connections. So, for example, although Brazil and Mexico had a high correlation, the correlation between Mexico and Argentina was really low. So you can't just talk about middle, it's South America, for example, as a continent, because there's no guarantee that if you air something in Brazil, it'll work in Argentina or vice versa. And even between, I remember the most extreme one, which surprised me a lot, was between Hungary and Poland. So both of Eastern Europe, neighboring countries, the correlation was extremely low.
Okay.
So, trouble is, I've just realised that on this diagram, I've given you the answer. I was going to ask the audience which country would they guess had almost zero correlation with any other country. But I won't. Let's not do it as a poll, Christian, because I've got a cross on the diagram.
Yeah, Japan.
Yes. Yeah. There's no correlation between ad performance in Japan and any other country in the database at the time. So, very particular style was required there. But I think it's important because it means that just because you've got a creative and you've measured, it might work well in some markets and contexts, but it might completely fail in others, and therefore it gets back to the idea of systematic measurement becomes really, really important, I think.
Yeah, I also think this puts the brands a little bit higher. Need for not just translating ads. I think a lot of companies are translating one-to-one what is going on in their marketing. They have a localization bureau or something like that, but they don't really have
it's way beyond that, because whether or not an ad will perform, translating it is just a small, that's just a hygiene factor, but it still doesn't mean the advertising is going to work at all. What we did do, actually, we went on and we looked at kind of what are the reasons, that advertising in one country might not work in another. And there are quite a few, and this summarizes some of those. I'll just take you.
Give me 2 seconds, Dan, before you go into the slide. You can just keep it down. We just have a question that I wanted to bring up before we go there. And actually, I want to ask the audience here, because I have a little funny question for you, and please play along here. So let me just run the poll before I answer this question. So,
Okay.
So if you look at this, what does that mean to you? This picture. I'm just going to start the poll here on the side, and please answer correctly as you can, at least.
Yeah, what is it? Yeah.
What is it in your opinion? Yeah, exactly. Okay, and then I'll jump here to the questions. Give me 1 second. So actually, we got 2 questions. One from Matt. That's a great point. Let me just bring it up here. That's a great point, Dan, but this is probably also why companies constantly are trying to go viral. So creating and boosting organic content towards doing branding in larger scale and across countries and markets. Don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, yes. It's like the Holy Grail, isn't it? It's like if you can create something that goes viral, you're going to get a fantastic return on investment. In fact, I've got an article coming out really soon that covers exactly this topic, and it's true. It's absolutely true. But when you think about it, there are famous examples, aren't they? Fairly recent, I suppose. There's Ocean Spray. Years ago, there was Coke and Mentos and everything in between. But I think there's a problem with the intention to make your advertising viral, and it's a numbers game. It's like, of all the, I don't have a statistic on this, right? I obviously, I don't know where you get one from, but I'm pretty convinced that of all the campaigns that were designed to go viral and probably had very little paid media spend behind them because they would tend to go viral, the proportion that do is relatively small, very small. So okay, it's fantastic if your content captures people's imagination and goes viral, or like in the case of Ocean Spray, some random person does something that you then amplify. That is fantastic, and you should always be on the lookout for that. But in terms of, I don't know, planning how to spend your budget and build your brand and managing your brand to maximize profit, it's too risky. It's too random. There's no guarantee.
Yeah.
It's
I'm sitting here thinking about like Gangnam Style,
Yeah.
how that would come out of the boardroom. I can't
Well,
see that happening, right?
occasionally things do go viral, but it's so rare. It is so rare, and it's not within your control.
No,
So
exactly.
therefore, it's not a very accountable way of doing marketing. It's like a gambling way of doing marketing. And I think if you're a tiny brand and you don't have any budget, you should create stuff and pay whatever you've got available to you in terms of paid media and hope it goes viral. That's fine. But if you're a big brand, it's not a way to go. I don't think so. Anyway, that's just it's an opinion. Maybe I'm too risk averse, but I think the intention's there, and the more, to be honest, also the more you intend to try and create something that goes viral, the more likely you might come up with something interesting anyway that does well, even if it doesn't go viral. So, yeah.
Exactly. We got another question from Peter here. He asks, when you talk about creativity, do you think real execution or advertising idea?
Well, obviously both. I mean, I think the best advertising campaigns or brands that advertise best tend to have an underlying idea that is not creative. I mean, the idea isn't creative. It's more the idea is resonant or insightful, and has therefore potential for executions that are very impactful. Yeah, if executed in a creative way. So it's kind of both. I think if you've got that idea that strikes a chord or is fascinating or interesting, then the good thing is you don't just come up with a one-off viral hit. You end up with lots and lots of ads that all do really, really well. Like it's really famous Kellogg's. It's UK, so apologies to others, but it's famous Cadbury's ad with the gorilla. You might well have seen it, where it's the beginning of what is it? Phil Collins, In the Air Tonight, is it?
We don't have it in Denmark, so I don't know.
Sorry, oh no, this is not going to work with your international audience, Christian. Apologies. But anyway, no, just very quickly. They had a big hit. It was a big phenomenon, but then they really struggled to follow it up because it was a one-off idea, not based on a resonant insight. Yeah. So I think the better things to have a fantastic idea, and then even your most mediocre ads do well, and the ones that are amazing do exceptionally well. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. Okay, we got another question here, and that's Richard. He just says, thank you for answering the question before. In relation to that, what do you take creativity to mean for you? Is it more about one or the other? And I guess we just answered that. So
I think we have. So it's yes. I mean, creativity, no one can pin down what creativity means. I mean, we know what the result of creativity is, which is that it grabs and holds people's imagination and attention. It's the difference between a social media ad that holds people's attention for 0.5 seconds, which is quite common, or 0.7 seconds, most ads are like that, versus the one that holds you for 5, 10, or even 20 more seconds. It's about grabbing and holding attention and appealing to people's emotions, I think. Yeah, just to build on that a bit. Yeah.
This is interesting.
It's a stick.
Oh,
that's perfect. Yes. Oh, you got gold as well. Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the next slide.
Okay,
I think that's a very, very good way.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna have to jump straight to that one. Oh, yeah. I'll jump straight to that one, just to follow on from the poll that we just did. In that analysis that we did, this huge project, there were effectively 7 reasons why advertising that worked well in one country might not work in another. And one of them, and this is my picture of the stick there at the bottom, is that if an advertising uses a cultural reference, that only applies in some countries and not others. And according to our poll, it's 50-50 in terms of the countries of the people on our poll. That is actually a divining or a dowsing rod or a divining rod. And in some cultures, it is believed, it's not true by the way, but it's believed that if you hold a stick like that or two separate sticks and they cross, when you walk over water, or apparently gold, I didn't know that, you walk over water, it'll kind of twitch. It'll twitch like that, okay? Which means you can find water, which is obviously valuable. So when I worked for Unilever years ago on the Lipton brand globally, I think it was Thailand came up with this ad, and it was brilliant, and it had a divining rod, and it was about Lipton iced tea. And the idea was this person was thirsty, and they used a divining rod, and the divining rod pulled them dramatically and engagingly towards away from the desert to this bar that had a Lipton iced tea. You get the idea, refreshment, water, fantastic. But the trouble was, we then tested that ad in multiple other countries, and it only worked in some. And we found out, in retrospect, that it was because the concept, the whole tradition, myth of a divining rod isn't global. It's only in certain countries, and you've got to be careful for that if you're going to use that kind of reference, for example. Now I've got 6 others to go through, Krista. I'll go through quite quickly because actually we get some good questions. But just to go through the other reasons why advertising might not work internationally. I mean, the first one is the category might be just very, very different. So, for example, butter. Butter is used in the UK, particularly for spreading on things. Toast, muffins, English muffins, scones, anything bready. All the time, right? But if you're talking about how butter is used in Mediterranean countries, it's completely different, because in those countries, they typically use olive oil for most uses that butter would be used for, and use butter only for certain things. So obviously, an advert that features the brand being used in that way in the UK is never going to transfer. The next one is about the brand needs different messages to unlock growth. I might just flick to, I think my favourite example of this actually is Pampers. Pampers in most Western markets did a phenomenal job by focusing on dryness, how it keeps your baby dry and comfortable. But it tried several times to launch in China, and it just didn't make inroads until there was an insight based on research that a much more motivating message is in China is the idea of helping sleep. So they came up with this golden sleep campaign, and it was phenomenally successful and helped launch the brand in China. So it shows that the message can be very different. So something that works somewhere may not work at all in others. The third one is brand status and credibility. This really relates to how long a brand has been established and whether it's already known about and loved, versus whether or not in another country the brand is maybe new and unknown or not very well known. There have been cases of trying to launch brands in new countries based on the latest advertising from the country of origin. And they often fail. They often fail because they assume too much credibility and knowledge. And actually, when you launch a brand, you kind of have to prove yourself. You have to explain what you do, for example, what you are, and why you exist. So there's a lot. Launch advertising is very different from kind of ongoing brand advertising. Quickly, just moving on from that. Sometimes advertising relies on advertising properties that have already been established. So this example came from Impulse, which is a body fragrance for women. And in the UK for 20 years, they'd advertised that the woman would use Impulse, and then a man would pass the woman on the street and smell her fragrance and suddenly act upon impulse. You see the branding there; it's quite clever. Or would buy her some flowers and take it up to her, even though he'd never met her before. which is all very lovely and romantic and old-fashioned and probably sexist. But that, that, that advertising, only worked after, after that whole idea had been established originally in a much more straightforward way, in a very obvious way. So later ads in the series didn't work in other countries at all. You always have to start again, go back to where you started for that successful campaign in your first country. Just quickly, a couple more things. One is obvious one. For example, if you're trying to resonate with a particular, I don't know, family in Birmingham, if you show a kitchen in a typical kitchen from Japan, they're not going to identify with it. So sometimes people just don't connect because they don't see themselves in what you're showing them. So obviously the advertising doesn't transfer. And I know I've gone a bit too quickly here, Christian, but finally, you've got to be careful about certain very specific things that could cause offence. So I did the fist.
Yeah.
I shouldn't do it really. I shouldn't. But I mean, I've got a summary here, which is things to avoid, and they usually actually relate to the body, interestingly enough. So do not put any hand signals in your ad that may or may not be interpreted in the same way in other countries. Sometimes they're opposites. For example, don't show the soles of the feet. You probably will have heard of some of these important things, but they're important. They're really important for some cultures. So be careful about how the body is portrayed and used, is what I'd say. There are other cultural faux pas that you can unfortunately fall into, but that's the main one.
Yeah, I think there's actually one thing missing here. It's the channels that you have available in a specific country. And we see this quite a bit like with the social channels that are simply established in one country and not in others. We have a lot in Asia, for example, that are very specific to Japan or China or India or even Twitter as an example. If you go to Turkey, most people will be on Twitter because it's just a way to communicate politics that are not controlled by the state, right? So there's so many things where it's different channels and different audiences and different perspectives as well on
that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And you cannot expect creative developed for one channel to necessarily work in different channels because they operate so differently.
Yeah, exactly. We have a few questions here. I think there's one here that we should start with. It's from Christopher. He says, "Hi Dan, thanks for the great lecture so far. How can we be structured in our approach to experimenting with creativity?"
Ooh, that's a big one.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Experimenting with creativity. Well, you see, I'm biased because I did a lot of. I spent a lot of my time in working in pre-testing, and I'm a fan. I know pre-testing is very what's the word? Love and hate. Some people love it, some people hate it. I was always a big fan. I'm still a big fan of pre-testing. If you treat it in the right way, if you treat it in this way, if you treat it as a way to explore things, experimental ideas, things you might even be nervous for. I mean, it's incredible how many of the famous ads from years ago actually would never have made it on air if it wasn't for some experimental pre-testing. I mean, the one I worked, like I personally worked on was Pepperami. Again, it's too UK. It's too UK. The point is, it's a salami in a pack, right? It's a snack salami, yeah. And the character was the salami, and the salami used to get chopped up, and it was quite macabre. It was almost quite dark, dark humor. And it's like the company who owned it would never have gone for it if they hadn't had the research results that said that people found it absolutely hilarious, and loved it. There are loads of examples, but I think it's what I have to say. Research. It's not about structure. It's about process. It's about try wacky things because sometimes they will go off the scale.
Yeah.
And the gorilla ad was off the scale. It was incredible. It scored higher than any other ad on our engagement metric, and you wouldn't have known that. And there was a lot of resistance. I've got the letter, I've got the correspondence to prove it within Cadbury at the time, saying no, we can't go on air. Yes, we can because people absolutely love it. Yeah, great. So that's how I'd address that one.
Yeah, sometimes there has to be like this element of surprise, right? To make it really stand out.
surprise is one of the most important elements of getting attention. Surprise, things you haven't seen before. People, if it's familiar, like a car winding down a mountain trail, you've seen it 100 times, you just switch off. Surprise is really important if you can tether surprise to your brand and your message.
Yeah, exactly. No, I saw a guy at a conference some time ago. He was doing some commercials for Booking.com, and they had it started out with a giraffe sitting at a computer booking a journey, right? And I just loved the idea because you instantly, what is going on here? This is not how it's supposed to be, right?
Yeah, I mean, people react to things they've never seen because I think it's. I think it's very primordial. Yeah, as in, if you've never seen something before, it could be a threat or an opportunity, and our brains are wired to look for the environment for anything that's not normal. If it's normal, who cares? It's boring. You've done it. You see it. If it's different, it might be a threat or an opportunity. So therefore, yeah, I know it's cheesy to say a giraffe. What was it again?
It was Booking.com. It was booking.
Yeah, fine. But you kind of go, what's this? And at least you get the attention. I mean, you have to hold it again. But I think that's really important. If you just do something that's been seen before or similar to the rest of the category, there's no point. You're not going to break through.
No, exactly. Okay, I have another question here before we go on to the next slide. I was just at an event where the Cannes Lion winners were celebrated for their incredible creativity. The top-ranked global campaigns often showed terrible performance when the data was added. So when we talk about creativity being the biggest variable for determining success, how do we apply the unified data model to develop creatives that are highly memorable and deliver high impact results?
Yeah, I mean, this has always been a big theme in advertising. You can come up with incredibly creative content that has no impact on the brand. I think the secret to like I said before, it's about tethering it or leveraging it, or and usually it's to do with how the brand is or isn't a part of what is creative, or the aspects that consumers respond powerfully to within the creative, and that's the big variable. So we said that creativity was the big variable, compared with media, it's the big variable. Within creativity, the way the brand is involved in the creative elements is the next big variable. By far. The brand, it is quite easy. Yeah, you can create an amazing spectacle and put it on air. And like I said, that distribution we showed earlier, some of the most incredibly impactful adverts out there had no impact on the brand, like almost no impact on the brand. I won't quote names because it's a bit kind of rude to the people who produce the advertising, but that is absolutely possible. But I mean, there are tricks and ways you can try and do this. Obviously, good market research will help you determine whether or not the brand is or isn't truly part of that. And so again, that's why I think I'm a big fan of research still, but because of that. I think just I know it's old. It's an old tale, but it's still useful. It's like if you kind of actually went to your grandmother, grandfather, and wanted to describe the ad in just one sentence, really, really succinctly, would you? If you could do it without mentioning the brand, there's a problem. If you kind of feel naturally that the brand is part of how you describe in that sentence, then probably you're going to leverage that creativity. I mean, I know it's not perfect, but I still do that now when I'm consulting. I go, how would I describe this to my grandmother? She's not alive, but that's not relevant. But and I go, oh, I don't think I'd need to. However I described it, I wouldn't want to talk about the brand. It wouldn't be relevant. So I'm thinking there might be a problem. It's a silly thing, but research will tell you that more accurately.
Yeah, exactly. No, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for answering that. I think also the next slide might help a little bit on this specific question, if I don't remember wrong on the slides.
I think this is my last slide, isn't it? Is it this one? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I guess this is a version of a slide I sketched. I don't actually know exactly when it was, but it was a very long time ago, at least a decade ago. because I was thinking, and this was just before I kind of became a marketer myself, as CMO. And I was thinking, this is kind of what I feel I need to be able to make good decisions about marketing, about advertising going forward. And it's got three kind of dimensions. And I know, therefore I have to use size of circle as the third dimension. But kind of like almost at first comes the size of the circle. And this is, if I use this content in this channel, so it's more about the channel, how many of my target audience can I reach? The number of people can I reach? Because reach is so important, as we've discussed before. So that's becomes really important. And you can see content A, huge circle, that's a good start. Brilliant. Then I want to know, okay, I've reached them, but obviously we know that the impact you get for each person reached can vary. It can be a very fleeting, not very powerful experience, maybe in social in feed can be quite fleeting, versus a cinema ad where you're really engaged and most people are watching intently for most of the ad, unless they're eating too much popcorn. But generally, but of course the reach might be a lot lower, so that might be something more on the sort of top right. But anyway, that's the other dimension I need to know. And then of course, in order to make good decisions about maximizing my return on my media budget, I need to know the cost that it took me to reach each of those people. Now, it seems really, it seems so easy, doesn't it? Oh, we just need these three pieces of data. But I think, like the poll you showed earlier, Christian, quite often we don't have these pieces of data, or even estimates or guesstimates of them, and then without it, I wouldn't know how to go. How to make decisions. So I'm a big fan of trying to estimate these three dimensions to help marketers.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think I just started a poll, by the way, to the audience. So if you would like to be part of it,
oh, cool.
do.
So,
it's very much about if you're actually measuring these three variables, right?
Oh, the three variables, yeah. And which one are people measuring? Yeah, and how they measure. I mean, they're not easy. I mean, I think that's probably the big reason. It's actually quite hard, especially like you say at that granular level by channel and by creative. That it gets harder and harder the more granular you get. But I think without some form of guesstimate or estimate or measure, you're just making decisions in the dark, I think.
Yeah, 100%. So I just had a question here. So how to measure impact? Because that's a very it's hard to get this metric, the perfect metric for impact. But I guess there's other ways to get there.
Yeah, there's indirect measures. I mean, obviously the ultimate, you can't measure. I mean, ultimately what you would love to be able to measure would be the impact on purchasing behavior in the short or long term. That would be perfect. You're not going to get that. It's just, there isn't such a metric. Well, it's not now. And obviously anything that happens in the future, you can't measure it now anyway. You'd have to wait a week, a month, a year, depending on how long the decay of the effect is. So, you never, so you need some sort of surrogate for impact. And, there isn't a universal acceptance about what that is. But you do have certain candidates that people use. And I'd say some of them include what effect did it have on brand, let's call it awareness or salience. I think that is a pretty good surrogate because of the evidence we've got that brand salience or mental availability, there are various exact ways you measure it, but they are a very good indicator, and they relate both to some extent to short and long-term sales. So if I was picking one, I would probably pick just some sort of salience, impact on salience measure. The one that goes with that, an alternative or ideally to go together, would be the impact on, I suppose, consideration. Yeah, it's back to the debate we had earlier about what's the difference between mental availability and brand regard. Well, both are important. So if you can measure both of those, and saliency and consideration are not bad surrogates for those two, they're pretty good. If you could, a combination of those two would be what I would choose personally. A combination of those two would be a pretty good surrogate for short stroke long-term impact that the data would suggest would lead to long-term, to sales, total sales. So I would always go for, personally, I would always go for those two. I can't think of any others that would beat those, but I'd love to hear people's thoughts on a measure that something I wouldn't go for is things like click-through rates or engagement, amount of time spent, or etc. Just because they have been shown to not relate to long-term brand effects at all. No correlation. But there's always a caveat, and the caveat is that if to drive your business right now, you need people to click through, and then you get a certain conversion into sales. That is always different. It's not, that's about short term versus long term, but long term, the other metrics.
Yeah, no, I think it's. I mean, there's many different ways to measure things, and I think that's the very tough part here. How to actually get these numbers in a way that's not manipulated, or also like how people think when you go to the shop, and if you choose the Heinz ketchup or the non-branded ketchup, like I do not remember the commercials that make me make that choice, but I often make that choice, right? So
Yes.
they have changed my mind in a way that works forever. And
Yes.
yeah, and this is very hard, right, to figure out if the brand value, because when people are asked the question, I'm not always sure if they think about it. It
They
can also
can't.
just be music.
I don't think people can answer that question. Like, what was it that made you choose this one or that one? All you can do is, did exposure to this thing have an influence on some sort of perception that we know is important to sales? You have to do it indirectly. You can't ask. No, definitely not. Yeah.
No. Okay, we have a few questions here. So we have Rosie. So she asks us, in the last graph, when you talk about content A, etc., is that one creative or one channel or one message, multiple channels?
Yeah, I kind of purposely kept it a bit vague. You could use it on different levels. I'm thinking you could use that same slide, and you could almost have like, channel A, B, C, D, E, or format A, B, C, or even if you're in just one channel, execution A, B, C, D, or E. So I think the concept would be the same in all of those. And obviously the ideal is if you can do it the same way across all of them, that would be absolutely amazing. But it really depends on what data you've got and what decisions you're making. But in theory, you could. I mean, what we used to do when I was doing cross-media analysis would be, for the big channels like TV, still fairly big, you do it by execution. You might have 2 executions or 3 or whatever. But for smaller channels, you would just group it together as a channel. So you'd be able to compare the channel, the small channel, whatever that is, magazines or something, with TV as a whole, or TV execution A, B, or C, exactly. So I think both levels are relevant depending on your media plan.
Yeah, 100%. I was actually thinking it's both, like if you have your taxonomy, you can kind of like filter on different levels, right? And you would be able to say, okay, in one country, which of my content types are performing, or the specific assets.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question here. So that's from Greg. So Greg asks, should we stop thinking about global campaigns? I think this will be the last question we take today, because we only have 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we just stop there. Should we stop thinking about global campaigns? Or yeah, what do you think about that?
I'm just quickly skimming through.
Yeah, I just wanted to start.
I think it's legitimate to talk about global ideas, and a slide I didn't show here, but I'm happy to share with Greg if you get in contact with me afterwards. Which is, there are ways you can create global campaigns that avoid the issues that I showed you on that slide. That was all very negative, really, but there are common things. There are common cultural references like soccer and, I was going to say the royal family, maybe, I don't know, but there are things that are shared across the world that, if it's relevant to your brand, you can do. But also you can have ideas that are then implemented in different ways in different countries. So you still have this consistent way people think about the brand, but you execute it different. And I've got a nice Snickers example to illustrate that. Yeah. So that's my quick answer.
Yeah, that's a very good commercial, by the way. Cool. Yeah, so we're running out of time, Dan. I just want to thank you so much for taking your time to be part of this. There's a few more questions, and I'm just going to send them to you by email. And for the people that asked them, we'll make sure to answer you by email afterwards. I want to just say that yeah, we have another webinar coming up. Let me just share here. So it's with Sten Rasmussen. We're going to talk a bit about GA4 and how to collect data for that. So very much about the web analytics part of the funnel. But you can already sign up right now on our webpage. And yeah, and else, Dan, I just want to really thank you again for doing this. I think this was really interesting.
Okay.
And thank you as well to all of the audience for all the great questions and all the chatting and stuff. That's just been really amazing.
Brilliant.
So I think I'm gonna close it down. But see you all another time. And yeah, bye bye.
Bye. Bye.